Hello.
Our story begins in the middle of a protest on a Republic world. It had been a month since the Republic gained control over the clone army from Kamino. Obi-Wan Kenobi was bartered for on Geonosis by the Jedi Order, and Anakin Skywalker never got married. Yoda inspected the clone army and brought it back to Coruscant for review. The Sith plan, on the other hand, was operating smoothly. Dooku had a droid military created and placed in reserve, per Sidious's request. But the Dark Lord was in favor of Dooku's plans to use the TK Trooper program for his own military. The Stormtrooper program was called brilliant by Sidious, because he saw the use of battle droids as too jarring. If they could let the Separatists rally behind an army of human soldiers, it would further the galactic divide. Palpatine had plans in place to make sure he could win in a scenario that they went with the TK Trooper program. He had alternative styles of playing the game if the public reacted in any number of ways. If they took things negatively, then he'd make Dooku replace the TKs with battle droids. If the public responded negatively to that, then he'd play the martyr of the Peacebringer, only for the Stormtroopers to commit a genocide. These plans went on and on and on. All that mattered, and the main point being, that Palpatine had a plan for everything in case something went wrong. He knew all the ways to manipulate the Republic into his favor, and he had no issue with doing it. Dooku had a very difficult job to fulfill over the years leading up to the Clone Wars. While yes, he did have his droid military force, they weren't supposed to be seen or used. All he was going to do was use the tactical droids, and eventually super tactical droids. It was believed that the algorithms inside these various droid units would provide quote-unquote more victorious scenarios than regular admirals and generals. The entire point of this proxy war was to make it look like the CIS actually wanted to win. Without the attempt to actually win the war, then the entire thing would come off as a setup, one created by Dooku to give his friend Palpatine power or something. There could be no loose ends, and the two Sith made sure of it, which is why the entire deal with the Jedi was undercover. Palpatine in any other scenario would have made it a public debacle, but he needed the war to be started quietly. It needed to come from the Stormtroopers and the clones. Without the TK units working openly against the Republic, people would never back the idea of using the clones against real citizen troopers. The stage was set perfectly for this to happen. The rival Jedi were left in the dark, and the protesters marched on the capital. It was a planet in the Mid-Rim, one that was going to secede from the Republic and join the ever-growing separatist movement. Clones were sent to the planet to de-escalate the situation, and they did, until the protests got worse. It was an event watched by people around the galaxy. Broadcasters had this showing on every station 24/7, because they wanted to capture every second of the drama. The clone commander stood at attention, keeping the protesters away from the Republic embassy. It slowly got more and more intense too. The people would come and go, and their signs of protest would get more radical. Be gone with the clones, kill the clones, no lab experiments. Some of these signs got really personal, especially when the clones were minding their own business and doing their jobs. Despite the Senate supporting the creation and use of the clone army, there were those who started to regret the signing of the Military Creation Act that was forwarded by Jar Jar. After 4 days of protesting, each day getting progressively worse, the galaxy was on edge. Then the first protester struck a clone trooper. They reacted. This was all done as an op. The individual who attacked the clones was paid off by Dooku. Ironically, he would die in the fight that would follow. Due to the way the protester reacted, the clones quickly took him down. Then more individuals joined in. The protest turned into a brawl, and the brawl turned into a riot, until the clone commander gave the troopers orders to set for stun, which they did. Blaster fire erupted and citizens were knocked out of the brawl, as the clones, who hadn't taken a single casualty, moved forward. They secured the stunned individuals and then set up a perimeter around the embassy, telling all protesters that their time to be rowdy was over. As the clone commander was trying to calm everything down, a number of individuals marched towards them. They were wearing white armor, similar to that of the clones, and they raised their weapons. People around the galaxy watched on edge as a tactical droid walked out from the crowd of new soldiers and told the clones to lower their weapons. They were outnumbered. A small talk started, one where they bickered, and the clone tried to have a rational conversation. But the droid was given one objective: lure the clones into a fight, but make sure the clones hit first. It took about 20 minutes for the first shot to be fired. When the first TK trooper hit the ground, they all opened fire, and the grounds of the plaza became a bloodbath. Clones and TK troopers fired away, none of them having any cover, and it became a massacre. The clones lost the battle, simply due to there being more TK troopers and the clones being worn out from 4 full days of protest. The galaxy stopped, and the CIS welcomed the rebellious world into their alliance. and then declared war on the Republic. It was a terrifying time, and what made matters worse is the Jedi had sent individuals to intervene, but they got caught up because Dooku laid traps for them. The Jedi that were meant to stop this very thing from happening were being shipped to Sereno in cages. They would be killed. But this left the Jedi looking fragile in a time of need. On a note about the Stormtroopers, they'd only been a part of the CIS military for about 3 years. The longest serving member of their military was a 3-year vat. This was aside from the Republic military personnel that joined their fight, but the entirety of the Stormtrooper Corps was made up of 3-year vets or lats. The CIS couldn't really parade the idea of having a standing military, so Dooku called it an alliance, similar in nature to what the Republic world of Eridu had set up, called the Outland Region Security Force. It was just another way to prove this wasn't a real military, rather something that helped them have everything set up for when their alliance became real. It was, as Dooku quoted, in protection of their interest against pirates. Dooku had a bunch of systems that considered joining his alliance set up these TK cores. It wasn't too difficult once he got allies. Some of the people he even contacted to join his little cause were Duchess Satine of Mandalore and Governor Tarkin of Eridu. Neither joined, but when someone joined, he was able to gift them armor and so forth, so they actually all looked uniform. The last month or so, ever since the Military Creation Act in the Senate, these units of TK troopers were unified, but because all their commanding officers were tactical droids, it didn't change a thing, so the entire military was already united, just spread out across different fronts, considered different alliances. On Coruscant, the Jedi had a major issue. They couldn't stand and fight in this war. They did try to find their messengers and where they went, but they'd never be found. The Council believed Dooku was behind their disappearance, but truthfully, they couldn't do anything here. It was a bind. If they supported the CIS, they'd lose respect from the Senate and the Republic, which was kind of an issue, considering Coruscant was their home. On the flip side, if they supported the Republic, they would end up fighting against actual citizens of the Republic. While technically not now, they were. Yoda wanted to tread carefully, and Sidious knew he would. So he made sure Yoda had to work quickly and force his vote, telling him that the Republic was desperately in need of individuals to lead their military. If they didn't join, then they'd be stuck without the Jedi. Palpatine roped them into his cause because he convinced them and the public that if these TK troopers and if the CIS won, then they would enslave the galaxy. The Jedi didn't want to believe it, and they tried contacting Dooku, but every time they made contact, he told them that their cause was too lost. It was time for the natural order to be reset, and in that new order, there'd be no more Jedi. Without a proper engagement with Dooku, there'd be no confirmation that he was a Sith. So for the Council, it didn't make any sense for them to willingly join this conflict, especially since they had no proof that Dooku was serving their ancient enemy in the Force. In its Senate session, one that Palpatine forced the members of the Council to be present for, they would inform the Republic that as Jedi, it was their duty to bring the peace. Many senators saw this as weakness. The war had already begun. TK troopers and clones were engaging across multiple battlefronts as they spoke, and the Jedi wanted to maintain a sense of neutrality. But that's what the Jedi wanted. The Order needed to, so that they could help bring balance to the galaxy. Palpatine was disgruntled with this, believing that if he kicked the Jedi off Coruscant, the Senate would see that as going too far. Instead of trying to push the Jedi away, he gave the Senate a choice. He told them that they could recognize the Jedi for the decision to be neutral, or they could ignore them and see them as a light version of the Confederacy. It was cruel, but the Senate leaned towards the latter option, believing that an order focused on neutrality was a weakness that would burden them all. The Council didn't like the way things were going, but what could they do? They were unable to do pretty much anything aside from hope that they wouldn't be left behind. Palpatine communicated that this was a time of war. Peace had come and gone. If the Separatists and Dooku wanted to fight, then they would defend their way of life. Palpatine played the martyr he was, and he told them that he would defend their democracy with the entirety of his life. It was something he cared passionately about. Defending democracy was everything to him. With the people radically rallying behind Palpatine, Dooku had to walk on eggshells. Due to using a human army, he needed to be a leader. He couldn't just drive their movement into the ground by supporting the corporate greed of the Trade Federation, Commerce Guild, Techno Union, and other corporate states. He needed to be their version of Palpatine, which also meant he couldn't tell these TK troopers to execute civilians or starve them. These men and women were fighting for a better galaxy, one free from the Republic. So if they started to oppress the people of the galaxy, then they'd be no better than the Republic they were trying to dismantle. Dooku saw this issue start to rise, but there was yet another problem for him. Due to the script they had for the Clone Wars, The CIS was supposed to come out and win nearly immediately, but they weren't. The TK Troopers were good, but the clones were better. Had they been using an automated army, the droids would have been more effective, simply due to their numbers. The TK Troopers were in all actuality fantastic, because they did outnumber the clones, but their issue was morale. Automated droids would fight to the last soldier. These men and women took cover, they called for medics, and they fought with everything against the clones. They succeeded in the space arena, simply because the CIS Navy was prepared for war, but that was about it. On top of that issue regarding the TK Troopers and their land battles against the clones, there was another problem for Dooku. The TK Troopers were starting to take up issues with their leaders. The tactical droids were cunning masterminds, which was a big reason the TK Troopers won their space battles, aside from superior numbers. But these tactical droids were cunning, because they, like Dooku and Palpatine, only cared about the result, not the casualties. They couldn't blame the tactical droids because it was their programming, but they were causing numerous issues within the ranks of the TK Troopers. There was a very large disconnect that happened, and the TKs didn't appreciate the lack of personality that these droids had, especially because they were their leaders. The tactical droids would regard the TKs by their TK numbers, when they each called each other by their names. The droids would send them in droves, only for a firing squad of clones to rip them limb from limb. They got the job done, but the troopers started to wonder, at what cost? Dooku managed to keep everything going for his war effort, but it was becoming difficult. The Republic was starting to lose battles, and the war was going in favor of the script. This was also aided by the release of General Grievous and the Malevolence, which was called the Liberator. It sounded more user-friendly for the TK Troopers manning the cannons on the ship. Grievous was given direct orders to be kinder to the men and women of his crew. Dooku hoped that the message could be that elite troopers get jobs with more human-like leaders. Grievous didn't care about what Dooku said, but he made sure they got it to work. Without the Jedi fighting in the war, the people of both sides saw them as useless, because they were currently trying to negotiate a peace treaty. They weren't working on behalf of the Republic or the Separatists. That was the only issue. Neither state of government acknowledged them. Senators from both sides did, though. The death toll on the TK Troopers had the Confederacy moving to remove their warriors from the front lines, but Dooku was adamant that they could win this war, because at this point they were winning, so the Senate stayed the course. Aside from the political atmosphere, the war itself was much more gritty and intimate, because both sides fighting were sentient, and the war was a lot more difficult on the psyche of a lot of troopers. The clones were trained with battle droids, but they were bred to be soldiers, so a lot of normal human emotion from killing another human was taken out of them. They were created to be human-killing machines. It didn't mean that the clones were heartless, but as the war turned into a couple-month-long conflict, the clones started to feel that heartless might be the best approach. Similar to how things went at the beginning of the war, the Separatist freedom fighters started to refer to the clones as lab machines, calling their mothers droids, telling them that they were nothing, they weren't real humans, they weren't real soldiers. All they were failed experiments. What didn't aid this slander was the fact that the Stormtroopers were actually winning. Sure, it was in the script, but the Stormtroopers outnumbered the clones 5-1. The odds weren't too terrible because one clone was worth typically 3.5 Stormtroopers, but still, those weren't winning odds for the clones, and because they kept getting decked by Separatist fleets, they couldn't rely on winning ground battles to actually win the war. Inside the Jedi Order, there was a rupture. Anakin, being one of the many Jedi a part of this rupture, believed that the Jedi should join on behalf of the Republic. A lot of these Jedi understood the implications of signing up to serve alongside the clone army, but they believed it was the right thing to do. If they didn't, then they could cost the galaxy a government that actually cared about them. Sure, some of these Jedi were really drinking the Republic Kool-Aid, but they believed that to fight for the righteous, they needed to stand with the ruling government in the galaxy. The Council decided that as a means to maintain the peace within their order, they'd put it to a vote, which they did. The result wouldn't be too surprising, as the Jedi would side with the Republic, and therefore the Order would be dragged right into a war they wanted no part in. The public saw this move as a political one, rather than a righteous one, which was the true irony of it. The public believed the Jedi had worn their welcome because they spent so long trying to come to a decision. The war was going unfavorably for the Republic, and the Jedi just now decided that they wanted to help. Even more ironically is the Jedi weren't going to do that much. They couldn't. Just because the clones were losing didn't mean the Jedi would instantly start winning. For Palpatine, this meant he could throw the blame onto the Jedi, just showing that they were making things worse for the Republic movement. But it would be thanks to the Jedi that the Liberator would be destroyed. It was a huge Republic victory, morale-wise at least. But the Jedi felt terrible about it. There were about 12,000 crewmen inside that ship. Grievous wasn't killed, but his crew was. Due to the ships being designed for a droid army, there were like no escape pods. Okay, maybe one or two, but not enough for 12,000 people, all the ones that died when the ship went down. The result of the destruction of the Liberator was a group of angry and determined TK troopers, and there was the struggle for the Jedi. Had they been killing clones or droids, it would have been semi-forgivable. Labs and droid foundries were much different than actually killing humans. The Jedi, once they entered the lines of combat, tried to use any approach they could to not kill the TK troopers, but it was an impossible task. Every time they tried to play the middleman, it ended up costing more Republic clones. This was the real travesty. The Jedi recognized all the clones as individual beings within the Force, just as much as they did the TKs. So them killing the TKs had the same effect as losing the clones. They were literally stuck. And with the Republic and now CIS turning on them more and more, they were really stuck in a bind to earn some sort of favorability back. They would continue to struggle with this aspect, whereas even for Republic citizens, the clones were becoming too much. Reports were being published by the Confederacy about the sick treatment the TK troopers received on the battlefield, and how the few survivors and captured were dealt with. The clones would do exactly as the TKs did to them. They'd berate them verbally, tear down every ounce of mental fortitude they had, and then let them see their fallen allies before locking them away in a brig. There were many more prisoners for the Republic, but the clones were starting to consider the possibility of killing everyone who tried to surrender. The only reason this was at all considered is because the TKs didn't spare clones. Sometimes they'd even personally execute them publicly. This war was brutal. The rivalry between clones and stormtroopers was one of the ages. Despite the numbers being in favor of the Separatists, the clones still found a way to come out on top. Their resilience plus the new Jedi reinforcements aided them. Plus, the TK troopers didn't have the necessary training to handle the adversity of a war as gruesome as this. However, there was another plague for the TK troopers. About a month after the first full year of combat, the tactical droids were promptly replaced by super tactical droid units. The Stormtroopers had been asking for replacements for the longer part of the year. Not because they weren't successful, but because tactical droids didn't care about them. They were treated as street rats and they were fed to the dogs of war. They wanted human counterparts to lead them, and instead they got more advanced versions of the droids they already hated. The reason this became an issue, aside from the already jarring point made, was the fact that the TKs learned that their government wasn't as liberating as they once thought it was. They found out through external resources that Dooku was acting as the Republic. Had the CIS used the droid army, the corporations would have been more present. Instead, the droid armies which filled the reserve for the CIS, in case a TK trooper rebellion, were funded by massive corporations that supported and stood behind Dooku. So like the Republic, where corporations were the bureaucrats that ran the government, Dooku was controlled by all these corporate powerhouses. The TKs saw this as an exploitation of their skills, seeing that their war wasn't one for themselves, but one of greed and corruption. Their morale was already crushingly low. For people that had as big as an ego as them, it was very difficult to handle having the clones at a 1-to-5 ratio, and still lose numerous battles. Now to add to their individual dilemmas, they learned that their fight was one against themselves. They became stormtroopers to fight greed, and it turned out they were fighting their own sense of greed. Instead of taking their anger out on the test tube babies, they turned their focus and rage back at their leaders. Dooku was prepared for this. The TK spent a year slaving away for a war that would destroy them, especially when he released the reserve separatist forces. Therefore, the Clone Wars became a three-way war, one where the clones and TKs teamed up in a fight to fight off these reserve forces. The only reason the clones or the Republic got involved was because there were so many reserves that they leaked into Republic territory. The Stormtroopers took it very personally that Dooku would lie to them, and so they did everything they could to strike back. The notion that they lost hundreds of thousands of brothers and sisters for nothing was unbelievable. The feelings were intoxicating and their rage was blinding. All the while, the Jedi still tried to bring peace to the galaxy, which really wouldn't get them anywhere, because the CIS military was fighting itself. There were a number of CIS worlds that fled to Confederacy due to these revelations and the civil war taking place across their own military. These systems were brought into the Republic by the Jedi or into the Neutral Systems Coalition by Duchess Satine and her allies. After about 3 months worth of combat, Dooku's castle would be bombed by protesters from Sereno, many of them volunteering to run what would become a self-death mission. It was never intended to be that, but it became that. They did their job though. They effectively wiped out Count Dooku. and that left the CIS Council, or the individuals profiting off the war the most, to themselves. The Stormtroopers took control over their government on Raxus, after finishing off droid forces outside the planet. The reason the war with the droids went so relatively seamlessly is because the TKs used most of the Separatist battle droid strategies in their own battles, so they knew how to counter them. They also knew how the algorithms worked on the super tactical droids and tactical droids. They would do what worked, so a lot of proxy battles in this proxy war were fought. Battles that the Stormtroopers used to make the droid leaders believe they could effectively win by using a very weak strategy. When the droids got comfortable using that same strategy galaxy-wide, they were caught with their circuits out. Plus, once the TK troopers captured the corporate leaders, it was only a matter of time until they surrendered. The other half of this war was waged by the Jedi and Palpatine, so when the Stormtroopers won their civil war, they opted for peace. In an odd turn of events, this led to the public trusting the Jedi and rejoicing in Palpatine. It was bizarre for Palpatine. He couldn't execute Order 66 because the public now liked the Jedi, but he also was seen as a hero. To Palpatine, it didn't make a lot of sense on paper. But in a way, it worked in his favor, so could he really be all that upset about it? Though this did make his predicament extremely weird. The Jedi trusted him, and the public loved him. He couldn't get rid of the Jedi. How was he like, what? Palpatine was probably the most confused he'd ever been. It didn't make any sense. He had everything planned perfectly, and while yes, it worked, he couldn't get rid of the Jedi. At first it looked like a possibility, but that wasn't even a reality at the moment. There was jubilee across the Republic. They won the war, and they did it without having to drag themselves into an escapade. It was over and done with within the span of a year and a half. Palpatine didn't have too many emergency powers, and the Senate had enough power to revoke what little he had and make sure he didn't get stressed with all the extra power as they moved from a time of war into a time of peace. The result was jarring for Palpatine, but he played the part of the martyr politician. As he did, the Jedi Order moved out to run mercy missions, partnering up in a temporary alliance signed by the Republic Senator Padme Amidala, the Neutral Systems Coalition leader Duchess Satine, and the CIS Senator Mina Bontiri. This treaty granted the Jedi Order the chance to deliver supplies to people that needed them, as well as assist those in need of assistance. The war took a lot from the people of the galaxy, especially in the Mid-Rim, and the Jedi wanted to make sure they gave back. These missions were something that was widely supported by the Republic and the citizens, mostly because they won the war. If it was a draw, these feelings would be much different. As they saw it, the Jedi won a war with the Republic, and were providing a sense of mercy on behalf of the Republic without wasting taxpayer money, so win-win, which was technically true anyways. Anakin during this time would re-engage in missions with Padme, and they'd pick up right where they left off on Tatooine, before the tension started to rise. This really benefited them, because the previous year and a half gave them time to really be themselves and grow up. Perhaps now they could take things slowly, and they wouldn't. With the Jedi working overtime to make sure the people of the galaxy felt relief, they proposed something to Palpatine, which made its way out to the Senate. It did have to do with the Outer Rim, and it was supported. They had a military, why not use it? The Senate devised a 10-year plan, because they didn't want their hostilities with the crime families to reopen any issues with the Confederacy, which was not integrating back into the Republic. That perhaps was the only issue the Republic had. It was the fact that the CIS didn't become Republic again. They were a separate entity, with pieces falling off. The Neutral Systems also didn't join the Republic, but that was because Satine wanted everything to ease up before tying the knot with the Senate. She didn't stop others from her coalition from joining, but a majority of them didn't. The Neutral Systems weren't as formal as the Republic, not as broken as a Confederacy, but perfectly aligned where they all benefited positively, without an overarching government. And even though Satine was the main voice, she didn't act like a Countess or Chancellor. She was just leader of Mandalore. There would be Jedi intervention on Mandalore to help her with Death Watch, which was allowed because of the agreement that was signed at the end of the Clone Wars. As the months passed by, the Confederacy slowed down its process and tried to reform its government without corporate greed. When they did something rambunctious. The Stormtroopers made a move on the Republic and surprise bombed the Chancellor. Palpatine at the moment was trying to figure out how to deal with the Republic and the Jedi. There was so much euphoria around him that he couldn't turn anyone against anyone without losing his support. He figured he'd just ride the wave. Because so much had changed in the wake of the war, he had to literally just become a Chancellor and start working on persuading another Jedi to join his ranks. But who would? The Jedi didn't look corrupt, they just helped end the war. Regardless, the TK troopers sent their own, as Senate guards, to the Senate building and they bombed themselves and Palpatine. But the blast didn't kill him. The Jedi believed it was a miracle, and they brought their council members and Jocasta Nu to Palpatine's side. The poor elder politician was dying, and they were going to try and save his life with a Force heal. Yoda was by his bedside, with Palpatine's eyes only open. He was watching the Jedi as Yoda explained that they'd perform a Force heal on him. Palpatine just watched as Yoda closed his eyes and moved his hand towards Palpatine's chest. It would take the combined effort of the Council to save Palpatine without sacrificing a life to do so. As Yoda reached out, he felt something so dark. His eyes opened and he could see Palpatine's yellow eyes. His jaw dropped and Palpatine was locked in a state of paralysis, so he couldn't even do anything. Perhaps his worst nightmare. He couldn't move, just stuck, looking at a bunch of Jedi staring at him, knowing exactly what he was. Yoda and the Council came to a decision. He was going to die, just let him die in peace. The Sith would be gone, and even better, the public could have their martyr. So the Jedi just watched the last Sith die under the weight of his physical injuries. It was a shame, but the public understood the Jedi went in to save his life, and they sadly failed. The people respected the Jedi at the very least for trying. Then all their jubilee turned to rage, and the Republic broke off the peace treaty and declared war on the Confederacy. Their sole motivation was to wipe their filth from the galaxy, and thus begun the Second Clone War. The Jedi this time rushed to the front lines with the clones, and they drove straight to the mid-rim. The Confederacy used what they could, turning the battle droids against the Republic and hoping that the combined effort of Stormtroopers and battle droids would be enough to stop the clones and the Republic. But there was an issue. Due to Palpatine's pre-plan ending early, he still had batches of clones coming out of Kamino, and new war machines leaving foundries and shipyards. All of these were fresh and ready for war. The CIS, on the other hand, spent months planning for Palpatine's death and not much else. Like, sure, they had recruitments, but they were taking down the corporate minds behind the droid armies. They believed that their new recruits plus the droids could be enough to take on the clones because they outnumbered them. The sad thing is, the Jedi didn't even need to help, but they did. The Second Clone War would only last for the longer part of 2 months. Calling it a war was pretty generous, honestly. But the Republic marched right into the back of the mid-rim and squashed the resistance. It wasn't really even fair. But the Republic didn't care. The greatest Chancellor in the history of the Republic died for peace, and now they had it. The Jedi actually loved this. The Sith Lord had statues of him built around Coruscant and the Republic. A Sith would have loved the adoration, but a Sith would have loathed why they did it. Sidious's memory would be one in love for being a righteous leader of the free galaxy, not for being a merciless Sith Lord, one that surely started a war to bring the galaxy to his knees, not unite it. The Senate did see the effects of the corporate greed on the Confederacy, which forced them to push the corporate world away from Coruscant and try a republic without so many corporate interests. This resulted in respect from the former CIS worlds and the adoration from the Neutral Systems Coalition. The Jedi would pick up right where they left off, by conducting more mercy missions, and then, as was agreed upon before the Second Clone War, the Republic would move into the Outer Rim, the liberation of such a location being one key final step to uniting the galaxy. While the carnage of the Sith would leave many people within the former CIS without family members, it would ironically be through the Stormtroopers that the galaxy would be able to find its eternal peace. And that, my friends, is our story. Again, special thanks to all of our patrons: Benjamin Wells, Jango Fett Clone, Nick5098, INTJ Recluse, Ben Ingram, The Big Red Pure Mark, Diamond Constant, Darth Nemesis, Lord Tibb, CC2024, Galvin Gaming, Tristan Mandalore, Sir William 1767, Darth Revan, Granddaddy Bane, Laliant Sky Guy, Penguin, Cullen Rooney, Shark Midori, RJ38, Nick, Michael Erlanger, The Last Jedi, Apollo, WeWu670, Annika Stank Runner, CT7567, Toaster Oven, Oz of Oz, Darth Nox, The Eternal Padawan, Joshua Tem, Johnny DeGuin, Santa Skeleton, Jedi Sloth, Mr. Yeet Gamer, Lord Calig, Yanli66, Mammoth Studios, Anakin003, Lord Draken, Fordo's Legacy Star Wars, Airbus, Rex the Wolf, May 3 First Names, Dark Saint 46, Baron Joshua, and Lord Deadwing. For support on the channel, smash that like button, support my ways, check out the Patreon, cool things on there. Otherwise, let's talk about this story. This story was one I wanted to have a lot of twists in it. The previous Stormtrooper video was much more straightforward. I wanted this one to be a little different because I wanted to focus on and highlight the issues the clones and the Stormtroopers would have with each other, a more personal relationship in their war against the other. And I wanted their free will to be the reason Dooku kind of falls, because he is the Republic, essentially. He does basically the same thing they do, and it's their hatred for him, but also Palpatine, that leads to their ultimate demise, where they end up just hurting themselves in the process of trying to get back at the Republic. So I hope you all enjoyed. I love you all, spread the love, and always remember, my friends, may the Force be with you.